So these are significant dates for Orthodoxy in America. 1738 was the first major presence of Orthodox Christians in America, and it was here in Virginia. It was the Philip Ludwell, who was the local British aristocrat of Jamestown and Williamsburg, and he and his family had converted to Russian Orthodoxy at the cathedral in London in 1738, and his family were planters here. They had the major plantation in Williamsburg, and so you can see there's the ruins of a chapel at their estate. It was left to their estate, and in their townhouse in Jamestown, you have it's a little square, or rectangular house, but it has an apse on the east end of the basement. What could that have been? Usually American architecture or British architecture, they didn't build an apse, So it's very likely he had a chapel there. He was They were officially, of course, Anglican. Pretty much by law, he had to be Anglican, but the reality is that they were Orthodox Christians, and he would go back and forth. And he was given the opportunity to take Holy Communion back to America and do a lay service. So he translated all of the liturgies from Greek into English. We did a service down at William and Mary in the Wren Chapel using the text translated by Philip Ludwell. So that was pretty cool. And Philip Ludwell's descendants married into all of the major clans of the American aristocracy. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Robert E. Lee, all of these big names in American history. So there's a little Orthodox thread in there. Connected to that, in 1764 or thereabouts, there was a group of Greeks who were slaves, essentially, and including a priest, who had been bought slaves, or rather indentured servants, who had been bought to crew a vessel and to begin a colony for a landowner who was related to Philip Ludwell, because the British aristocracy is all connected. So they actually built the port of St. Augustine in Florida, but the Greeks all eventually converted to Roman Catholicism. So nothing happened there so far as the Orthodox Church.
They built the Star Fort there at St. Augustine?
Well, they founded the colony there.
Okay.
So that was probably the next presence of Orthodox in America. At the same time, in the mid-18th century, there were Russian fur traders going throughout not only the Aleutian Islands and the coast of Alaska, but there were also Russian fur traders going across to Greenland and finding out, and into Canada. And very often what they would do is they would preach to the natives and baptize them. They were laymen, but it's still a legitimate baptism. So Orthodoxy had some precursors. In 1794, a group of 10 monks arrived in Kodiak from Valom. Now remember, at this point, all of Alaska and all the way down to San Francisco was the Russian Empire. Actually down to the Russian River, which is just north of Bodega. Their first, their main, the monks went to Kodiak at the behest of the Russian American Company, and they went to, and they built a mission center and a church, a monastery basically, in Kodiak, and they sent monks out to evangelize. One of those monks was St. Herman of Alaska, who had come, and the group had come from Valam Monastery under Elder Nazari, which meant that they were spiritual brothers of St. Seraphim of Sarav, because Elder Nazari was his spiritual father as well. And St. Herman of Alaska was the spiritual foundation of the community. He was just a simple monk. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a deacon. Just a simple monk who lived a life of Hezekiah, of silence, as a hermit. And so the Kodiak mission had all sorts of ups and downs. Eventually, St. Herman got tired of all the politics and withdrew to Spruce Island, which was across a bay 7 miles now, which is open to the North Pacific. So you can imagine that it's not a very Pacific place.
Did that influence you, by the way, to join Valam?
Yeah. And so St. Herman lived there until 1833, or 1837 when he died. He was beloved of the natives. He did everything he could to serve the native people, because the monks who came over in 1794 as missionaries had as their prime objective to convert Americans. Now, those Americans happened to speak Aleut, Yupik, Tlingit, and Athabascan, but they were still Americans. So that was the foundation of Orthodoxy in America. Eventually, the Russians, some of the missionaries died, some of them went back, a couple of them were martyred. One of them was a bishop, or became a bishop, who he went back to St. Petersburg, did a report on how badly the Russians were treating the natives, which was why the Russians went on strike, or why the monks went on strike, and they refused to do anything for the Russians. They would do all the sacraments and everything for the natives, but no baptisms, no marriages, no nothing for the Russians, which is interesting, because they were abusing the native peoples. And so you have a very different perspective on how the Russians treated the native peoples, how the Russian Church treated the native peoples, as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church treating the native peoples in California and throughout Latin America. It's interesting that when Junipero Serra, who founded the missions in California, was up for canonization, the most vehement objection came from the California natives. Whereas when St. Herman was canonized in 1970, the most vehement support for his canonization came from the Aleut people of Alaska. And still, the Aleuts, the Yupiks, especially the Yupiks, are very strong Orthodox. The Athabascans and the Tlingits remain as Orthodox Christians in Alaska. So probably 50-60% of the native population of Alaska is Orthodox.
Is that where Matishka Olga comes from?
Yep, she was Yupik.
So Alaska started a little bit of Matishka Olga.
Yeah. 1842, 1823, Saint Innocent was sent as John Veniaminov, priest John Veniaminov, to a little island in the Aleutian chain, and his best friend was on the next island over only a couple hundred miles by kayak. If you can imagine going by kayak through the Bering Sea. But Saint Innocent got around, and there are incredible stories. When we eventually will tell you some of those. Some of the natives, actually, there's one story of a native village where the shaman of the village was visited by spirits, radiant spirits, who said, "This man named John is going to come to you, and he's going to tell you the truth, and you believe him, and you do everything he says. And he will be arriving on this day at this time." And okay, this is coming by kayak. It's not exactly like a train running on schedule, with autopilot and things. So Saint Innocent, Father John at that time, pulled up in his kayak onto the beach, and there was the entire village waiting for him, who greeted him by name, and he'd had no contact with them, and they all converted. He baptized them all.
You say that those were angels?
They were angels, yeah, undoubtedly. So anyway, after a very fruitful ministry, he needed a break after 20 years in the field, so he went back to Russia. While he was back in Russia, his wife died, and so Saint Philaret of Moscow, the great metropolitan of Moscow, took him under his wing, and he made him his disciple, and also made him a bishop. And he was so he got sent back. Saint Innocent got sent back in 1842 to America as its first ruling bishop. There was a bishop in 1799 who was sent back to America, and he drowned within sight of land. The ship went down. So Saint Innocent traveled all over his diocese, all over Alaska, and all the way down to San Francisco. And around the San Francisco Bay, he could speak fluent Latin, because at the time the Russian seminaries taught everything in Latin. So he made friends with the Franciscan friars down there, and he made clocks and barrel organs, so he kept himself busy. So he used to joke that now all those Catholic monks can dance to the merry tunes of Russian folk music on the barrel organs. Anyway, he was not long for America. He got transferred to Kamchatka, and Eastern Siberia, and so he went all over the place by reindeer back, by reindeer sled, by boat, and by foot, and on foot. That says he always had a bottle of gin in his bag. And he preached and taught, and he began he began a mission to the Chinese, and he founded the city of Blagoveshchensk, which is on the Amur River, which is the border between northern China and Russia. Eventually, Saint Innocent became he was going blind, and he had terrible leg problems. He was 7 feet tall. Now, when he was in Alaska, except for the Tlingits, who were like 6'8" and 7 feet tall, he was mostly dealing with Yupiks and Aleuts, who were about 5 feet tall. And Yupiks, or the Aleuts in particular, are very proud that one word of their language has entered into into kind of the international parlance, and that's kayak. And so they made a special kayak for him, because he obviously wouldn't fit in an Aleut kayak, but they made one identical design, only big. And St. Innocent had paddled all over the Bering Sea and the northern Pacific to all of these islands, including St. Paul and what's the other one? Those islands in the middle of the Bering Sea. Anyway, and founded churches. And so that took a great toll on him, physically. But eventually he ended up as the Metropolitan of Moscow, which was the highest position in the Russian Orthodox Church. And he founded the Russian American Missionary Society, which supported missions throughout North America. And in 1872, when Russia sold Alaska to the United States, he thought this was an act of providence for the expansion of Orthodoxy. And at the same time, the cathedral was moved from the main cathedral was moved from Alaska to San Francisco, and this is when English began to be used extensively in the liturgy and so forth. So that was the headquarters, and there was a trickle. At that time, there were probably 100 churches around continental U.S., another 100 in Alaska in 1872. By 1888, there were more like 500 or 600. And in 1888, there also was a huge immigration of Carpatho-Russians who were Uniates, Ukrainian Carpatho-Russian Uniates from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there was a priest by the name of Alexis Toth who they brought with them, or who they brought over, who they wanted to organize their church in Minneapolis, because there was a huge community, 1,000 plus families. And so being a Byzantine Rite Roman Catholic, he went to the local Roman Catholic bishop, whose name was John Ireland. Well, John Ireland turned out to be a great benefactor of the Orthodox Church, because he took one look at Archpriest Alexis Toth, who was this bearded, widowed man with, who looked very foreign and certainly didn't conform to the image of American Catholicism. And he said, "Go away. We don't want your people here. We don't want you here. You have no blessing to serve. You have, just go away. We don't want you." So Father Alexis went back to his parish council and said, "Well, the Catholic Church rejects us. There's a Russian bishop in San Francisco." And so they sent a delegation to the Russian bishop in San Francisco, and it began a movement of 300 parishes of Uniates into the Orthodox Church. Now, all of this is the history of the Russian mission in America, the Russian Orthodox mission, and as it was known. So at the time, before the influx of the Uniates, there were Greek parishes, there were Arab parishes, Syrian, there were Serbian parishes, and so most of the laity were Greeks, Serbs, or Arabs, but most of the clergy were Russians. There was before 1923, there was never a significant immigration of Russians to the United States. 1888, you have the Uniates coming in, who were not Russians. They were from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the area they now live. The area they were from at that time was Austro-Hungarian. It's now part of Ukraine for the time being, and but it's definitely not rich. They have their own tradition. The Carpatho-Russians are from these deep valleys in the Carpathians, which are the mountains that go through Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and they speak their own dialect, which is not really a written language. It's basically a kind of variant of Ukrainian, but it's very similar actually to Church Slavonic, and they preserve very ancient customs, like stuff from Constantinople, from Hagia Sophia, that had ceased to be used there hundreds of years before, but they preserved it, and so you have this group coming into a church where most of the clergy were Russians. Well, the Russians didn't know quite what to do with them, and they didn't know quite what to do with the Russians, but they founded their own churches, and nobody bothered to tell them there's a difference between being Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholic. That still is there. There was
still using the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom.
Oh, identical, yeah.
Yeah.
The text was identical. The ritual was a little bit different. The Uniates do things a little bit differently than the Orthodox, but not much, not significantly. And in fact, one of the reasons right now that we, how in the litanies we would commemorate Patriarch Kirill, Metropolitan Nicholas, and then me. It used to be they would only commemorate the local bishop, one commemoration. But sometimes, with the parallel jurisdiction between the Greek Catholics and the Orthodox, sometimes the bishops would have the same first names. So how do you know, is it a Catholic church or is it an Orthodox church? And so there was a lot of going back and forth. And finally they arrived at this arrangement we have now. Any questions to this point?
So that's the origination of that for Rocorp, is for the three, I guess, in that hierarchy, was that particular?
Well, that was adopted in America, but also it was also adopted in Europe. So there's not too many places left where they only commemorate one bishop. So usually it's the whole hierarchy that's in charge, all the way up to the top.
What state is our local bishop in?
New York.
New York? And that's for the whole country in America, right?
Well, he's also the Metropolitan of North America
Right, okay.
for ROCOR. I used to be the Metropolitan for the OCA of North America. So, anyway, there was another very significant immigration to the United States around 1888, and that was that Alexander III expelled 1.4 million Jews from Russia to New York. It was the largest single group to ever come into America, and so if you listen to Fiddler, if you know the musical Fiddler on the Roof, that's what they're talking about. That considerably altered New York. To have an influx of 1.4 million people who basically most of them stayed together for a long time. and they did very well. Whereas the Carpatho-Russians had come over mostly as indentured servants to coal companies and steel companies. 1896 to 1907. 1896 is when St. Tikhon came to America. He was a young bishop. He came to San Francisco. He's Bishop of San Francisco and of all of North America. And he was extremely active in not only the integration of the Uniates into the Russian mission. He went literally all over the continent, visiting churches, consecrating churches, establishing missions. I have a friend up in Washington State who has a little church up in the mountains above Seattle, above Tacoma actually, and he had me crawl under the altar table to see St. Tikhon's signature, because he signed. There's a cross piece, holding the altar together, and St. Tikhon had signed it when he consecrated the altar, and that was pretty cool. He consecrated a church in Calhoun, Colorado, which is 60 miles east of Colorado Springs. He consecrated churches in every corner. He went all over Canada. He went to Alaska. I don't know if he went to Mexico, but he was an incredibly industrious missionary. He had the services retranslated. There's a book by Isabel Hapgood at St. Vladimir's. We used to call her St. Isabel the Episcopalian, because she was an Episcopalian lady. Her translations are the basis for all of the translations that are being used now, still. That was around 1900, 1904. He had two very significant helpers, Father Alexander Kachurov and Father John Kachurov, who built the cathedral in Chicago, and Father Alexander Hodovitsky, who built the cathedral in New York, which are still there, huge cathedrals. And Father John Kachurov used to commute to Hartshorn, Oklahoma by train every 2 weeks. Can you imagine commuting from Chicago to Oklahoma every 2 weeks to serve a parish? Both of those, Father Alexander and Father John, became martyrs in the Russian Revolution. They were among the first people killed by the communists. St. Tikhon had a vision for Orthodoxy in America of a unified hierarchy, a Russian archbishop answerable to the patriarch, and each ethnic group would have a bishop who would oversee their own jurisdiction. But it would be a united synod of bishops, where there would be one archbishop for all of North America in an autonomous church. And this has continued to be a dream of the within the Russian Orthodox community, and a hope to be able to fulfill someday. 1906 was the great earthquake in San Francisco. It leveled the cathedral, so St. Tikhon began the plans for a new cathedral with royal money from the Tsar, and so you can still see the inscription of Nicholas II on the bells in San Francisco. But partly because San Francisco was in chaos, after the earthquake for years. He moved the center of operations to New York and left it and created a diocese in San Francisco. And then he got called back to Russia, where he had a couple of assignments. And in 1917 was the Great Council of the Russian Church, in which the church had wanted to meet in council for years, but it was always being put off. In March of 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. So there was no longer a Romanov Tsar, and the church was able to work freely. The Romanov dynasty for many years was a very bitter master for the church. Although starting in the 18th century, in the 19th century, things changed, and the czars became very pious and very truly leaders of the church. One czar, Alexander I, disappeared and became a monk. Others were led a holy life, and especially Nicholas II. 1917. Remember, the First World War started in 1914. Russia was embroiled in it and did not do well. And 1917, you had huge amounts of money being pumped into Lenin, who was in Switzerland, both from the Germans, who were, of course, adversaries of the Russians in the First World War, and from the Jewish community in America. There was a guy named Jacob Schiff, whose grandson, I don't know, is currently a representative in Congress. Adam Schiff, yeah. And who was J.P. Morgan's banker. And through Jacob Schiff, $20 million was sent to Lenin from J.P. Morgan. $20 million in 1917. Add some zeros. So you had two. J.P. Morgan was, wanted to support the revolution because his American oil, American Standard Oil, had made an offer to the Tsar to take over the petroleum operations in Russia, and the Tsar refused. But as soon as Lenin took over with the Bolshevik coup in 1917, he gave full rights to Standard Oil.
Rockefeller did?
What's that?
Rockefeller?
Yeah.
Standard Oil?
Standard Oil. What about J.P. Morgan? What's his? Yeah.
I thought he was a financier.
It's all mixed up.
I thought it was oil. Okay.
Yeah, but the oil. It's interesting that the oil politics was equally was very much involved in the even in the First World War and the Russian Revolution. So 1917, you had, at the same time as you had this great council of the Russian Church, which restored the Patriarchate and which also created, brought conciliarity to the Russian Church, meaning parish councils and diocesan councils, the All-Russian Council, these periodic meetings of advisory councils, which had not existed before that. There existed the Synod of Bishops, and the bishops made the decisions. But that goes back to St. Tikhon, who was also in 1917 at that same council was elected patriarch. And one of the things that St. Tikhon had done when he was Archbishop in America is he had had friends among the Episcopalians. And he saw how the Episcopalians ruled their church, and he thought, well, why don't we do the same thing? So he introduced some of these reforms into the Russian church. So that didn't go very well. Anyway, by 1918, the churches were being closed, the clergy were being butchered. Ultimately, the communists would slaughter 250,000 clergy, and 20 million gave their lives for Jesus Christ in Russia at the hands of the communists. It's brutal. It was just brutal slaughter.
You said 250,000?
Priests and deacons, yeah, and bishops. Almost all of the bishops were martyred. There were a few that they left alive to preserve some image that the church was being supported by the Bolshevik government. Anyway, that's a long, complicated story. But from 1917 up until 1991 was a period of brutal martyrdom for the Russian Orthodox Church. The same thing was going on in Tito's Serbia. It was going on horrific in Romania at the hands of the communists. 1923, from 1917 until 1922, you had the Russian Civil War. You had the Reds, the communists, the Bolsheviks, against the Whites, who were the Tsarists or monarchists, who wanted to, who didn't want to have this radical revolution, which would change every aspect of Russian society. The Reds obviously won, and thousands and thousands of people from the white side fled, and they fled all over the world. There were many who walked to China. Can you imagine walking to China from European Russia across the Himalayas? There were many people spread out around the Pacific Rim in particular. Many went into Europe. Others went into India across the Himalayas, and so it makes the Roman persecution of the Christians pale by comparison.
The reason why the Soviets did not like the Christians is because they saw them connected to the Tsar.
No, communism is based on hatred of God and hatred of Christianity, and communism is all about hatred. I mean, just look at what's going on here now. This is 1917 in the U.S. right now, so I think it's also worth saying that ROCOR has been probably one of the most solid anti-communist communities and organizations in the country for the past 70 years. Anyway, because so many of the there were bishops among those who fled the communist persecution, and priests, and they came under the leadership of Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky. Metropolitan Anthony had been the other candidate for patriarch, who lost to St. Tikhon. But the people around him pulled him out of Russia to protect him and to provide leadership for the church. And so he and many others, not only from the white faction, but just people who wanted to escape the communists, fled. They went to Constantinople, they went to various places, and ended up in Serbia, in Karlovci, Serbia, where the Serbian church gave them refuge and hospitality, and ecclesiastical hospitality. He permitted their bishops to serve and to create a structure to minister to the Russian refugees. By 1923, the patriarchate was able to issue an ukaz, which is a decree that decreed that all external dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church should organize their own lives until normalcy could be restored. Which of course nobody knew when that would be possible. And so in 1923, Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky in Serbia, under the shelter of the Serbian Patriarch, organized the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, formally. Among those who were part of that were the Russian Orthodox Archbishop of North America, the Russian Orthodox Archbishop of Western Europe, and the Russian Orthodox Bishop of China. There were these three major external archdioceses that, so China was everything from Korea, where there were many churches, all the way down, I think, to Australia. Then there was Western Europe, and North America, and South America. So the Russian American mission was already an integral part of the Russian church outside of Russia, from its very foundation. There was quite some characters who were in its leadership, scam artists, but for the most part, you had a church in America already in 1923 of probably over 2,000 parishes, which is pretty substantial. Now, at the same time, in 1923, there was a guy by the name of Meletios Metaxakis, who had been an archimandrite in America. He was Greek, or who'd come to America. He went around and organized some of the Greek communities and tried to persuade them to come under the jurisdiction of Constantinople. The Greek parishes hadn't fully participated in the Russian diocesan structure, because most of their parishes had in their bylaws, no bishop has any authority over anything in this parish, if you can imagine.
Even their own technical bit.
Even their own. Yeah. Some of those bylaws are still operating. But part of it, they were doing that to protect themselves, and part of it, the Greek church was in a very strange, in the early part of 20th century, was in a very divided position. So Meletios gets himself elected Patriarch of Constantinople. How much that cost, I'm not sure, but it certainly cost a lot. And he called a council. Now, it wasn't an ecumenical council, it wasn't even a full council of the patriarchs. There were like 15 bishops or so, from all over. There was Brokor was part of it, the Serbs and the Antioch and so forth. But there were two major areas in which it, one was they wanted to reform the rules for the remarriage of clergy after being widowed. According to the canons, if you're a priest and your wife dies, you have to become a monk. If you want to remain a priest, you have to remain celibate. And
Same thing if you get divorced too.
usually, well, at that time, if you got divorced, you were automatically defrocked. So they were, and it was interesting that the Serbs were pushing for this. I think partly because they suffered so many losses during the Second World War, or First World War. And so Meletius started to push that forth. But the most radical things that affected the whole life of the church is that, number one, he instituted the new calendar and forced it on the churches under his jurisdiction. And he began a policy of modernization. And this was this is something that is still very much with the Greek Archdiocese today. Not-Medixakis, he was a 33rd degree Mason. He was all these kinds of things, which something like that is like anathema to 90% of the Orthodox world. So
Wasn't he the one who was probably even before he became patriarch, wasn't he tied at the hip with the British crown at that point?
Oh, yeah.
Because of the British, I guess, had ruled that area with the Turks.
and Venizelos.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I usually refer to him as Meletius of sorry memory, because he really messed up the Orthodox Church. The Greek Church went into schism. About 30%, 40% of the Greek Church refused to become New Calendar, and so they stopped commemorating him. So he had the Greek army go in and enforce, and there were many people and priests especially who were killed because they refused to go over to the New Calendar. So the old calendarists of Greece had a pretty legitimate objection to what was going on.
What was the difference of the calendar? Did he add months or something? Or
Well, he changed the. Well, what he did. There was a difference of 13 days between the. 13 days. 1923.
I don't know
13.
where I heard this, but I heard originally we only had 10 months, and
No.
then he added to.
No, that's long ago. This is 1923. And so it's the difference between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. In other words, the Orthodox calendar versus the papal calendar. And so they adopted the papal calendar, where December 25th occurs on December 25th instead of on January 6th, which is, our Christmas is actually on January 7th. According to the Gregorian calendar. According to the church calendar, the Julian calendar, it's on December 25th. But December 25th on the Julian calendar doesn't occur until the 7th of January on the new calendar. In other words, what he did was he adopted the civil calendar and forced the church to adopt the civil calendar. And a lot of Orthodox have resisted that. Now, many of the churches, of the Orthodox churches, have adopted the new calendar. On the other hand, the Russian church, the Serbian church, the Church of Jerusalem, and
Mount
Mount Athos,
Wouldn't Georgia also?
and Georgia all followed all followed the Julian calendar. And that's probably 75% of the Orthodox world. Yeah.
So the true Orthodox are the ones who've just taken the adoption of the old calendar to the other end, like the other extreme.
Yeah.
And they're mostly Greek, right? True Orthodox? Or
Well,
most of those Greeks get that?
there's plenty of converts in that. And the true, so far as we're concerned, the so-called true Orthodox are not. There's schismatics. It's they've created a little sect, and quite and very honestly, a lot of the people in those groups had been cast out of the canonical church. So you got to be, they use anti-ecumenism and all of this other stuff as their rallying cry, but in reality,
Should we be celebrating Christmas on January 7th then?
that's what we do.
Okay, that's what the Ethiopians do as well.
Right. They're also on the follow the Julian calendar.
The way I see it is we just get 2 Christmases.
That's about what it is. Well, there's Santa Claus Day, which is a national holiday, and then there's the Nativity of Christ. And when we celebrate the full liturgical, feast of the incarnation of the Lord. But Santa Claus Day is a family holiday, and that's nice. But yeah. So anyway, 1923. So from 1907, actually a little earlier, St. Tikhon had actualized his vision of a multi-ethnic synod of bishops in America. So he had an Assyrian bishop, St. Raphael Hawawini. He had a Serbian who he wanted to have made bishop, Father Sebastian Dabovich, who grew up in the cathedral, was born in San Francisco, and was raised at the cathedral in San Francisco. He was the first U.S.-born priest. He had a Greek, I don't remember who it was, and so what they were trying to move towards this creation of a unified American Orthodox Church, where you have a single hierarchy over all the churches in America, which is the normal structure of Orthodoxy. The Greeks didn't participate because of Hellenism, essentially. They put Hellenism above Orthodoxy. They identify the two, but it's a false identification. And it's caused huge problems over the course of centuries. And that remains a major problem. So in 1917, all the leadership of the American Church was at the council in Moscow. And so the American Church, because at the end of as the council was ending, that's when Lenin did his coup. And then they started butchering priests. In fact, I think Father John Kucherov was like the day after Lenin's coup was killed. So the American Church was effectively decapitated because all the leaders were in Moscow for the council. They gradually drifted back because they didn't want to be caught in Russia in the middle of a civil war. But it was how do you escape a civil war? I mean, it's tough. So 1923, the exiles gathered together in Serbia with the local bishop of the Russian Church, and then the American, and then the Chinese. Let's see. So in America, you had this initial unity, but in 1917, all the money stopped coming from Russia, which had been given by the Russian Missionary Society and by the Tsar. That paid all the salaries of all the priests. All of a sudden, the American church had to support itself and its own mission, and that threw it into quite a quandary. And because the money, largely because the money disappeared, the various jurisdictions started pulling out and got their own bishops and their own priests from their own motherlands. So that's how we have all these multiple overlapping jurisdictions. And part of it too is that, they could organize their own communities much better than, say, a Russian going into the Arab community or a Serb going into the Romanian community or something like that. Also, start after World War I, there was a massive immigration into the United States. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, all sorts of ethnic groups from all over everywhere, and including Orthodox lands. And basically, the whole missionary vision that had been going on since 1794 and was being realized in a very concrete way by St. Tikhon got buried under the burden of trying to care for new immigrants and get them settled. And some of them came over with money. Some of the Russians who came over, they had been from the aristocracy and they brought also things with them, a few. Most of them were impoverished. It used to be you could go to the cathedral in San Francisco or in New York on a feast day, and you'd see these ladies from the nobility, all decked out in furs and diamonds and jewels, and it was all real too. And then and the men would be decked out as these were senior officers of the White Army, with all their decorations and all. It was quite a even though they were old by that time that I would see them. Of course, that's all gone, long gone. And so the 30s, the 20s and the 30s was a time of when the church was trying to figure out how to organize itself. ROCOR, a part of ROCOR disagreed with other parts in America, and so there was a little break, and then they got back together, and they were together until 1946. And the other part, there were two parts. One was the Russians, who formed contemporary ROCOR, who were the basis for contemporary ROCOR. The other was the Metropolia, that formed the basis of the OCA. The OCA wanted to go back under Moscow. ROCOR didn't want to have anything to do with any communists. They wouldn't have anything, and they suspected that the church was completely corrupted by the communists. Whether that was true or not is a different story. But that sets the scene for 1946, after the Second War and another immigration, in Russia, Khrushchev Stalin had capitulated to the church, reopened thousands of churches, and the Metropolia group wanted to go back under the jurisdiction of Moscow. They found out that the price would be a loyalty oath to the Soviet government. And there were no clergy that were going to take a loyalty oath to the Soviet government. So So with that, I'm going to have to leave you. We do Vespers.